In the gleaming boardroom of Whitmore Associates, a brilliant business strategist was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as a career-defining presentation took a shocking turn when they came face-to-face with corporate nepotism at its most vicious. Audrey Brown wasn't your typical employee. For 5 years, she had spent her life building authentic relationships with Fortune 500 executives, known for her ability to turn complex business challenges into million-dollar solutions. When she encountered Madison Whitmore's jealousy-fueled salary cut, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would reshape the entire consulting industry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Audrey Brown stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, her laptop connected to the wall-mounted screen displaying quarterly projections that would make any consulting firm salivate. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Associates' 42nd floor boardroom seemed to illuminate her very presence, casting her in the golden glow of corporate success. She had earned this moment. Every sleepless night, every missed dinner with friends, every weekend spent perfecting proposals had led to this. "As you can see," Audrey said, her voice carrying the confident cadence of someone who knew her numbers inside and out, Meridian Industries represents not just another Fortune 500 client, but a strategic partnership that positions us at the forefront of sustainable manufacturing consulting. Their commitment to a 3-year transformation program, valued at $42 million, brings our total Fortune 500 portfolio to 6 clients acquired in just 8 months. The boardroom erupted in the kind of restrained but enthusiastic applause that characterized high-stakes corporate celebrations. Robert Whitmore, the company's silver-haired founder and CEO, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man watching his investment pay dividends. His weathered hands, which had built this company from a one-room office 30 years ago, came together in measured claps. "Audrey," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority that had negotiated countless deals, "this is unprecedented. In my 3 decades building this firm, I've never seen anyone demonstrate such consistent excellence in client acquisition and relationship management. You've not only met our most ambitious targets, you've redefined what we thought was possible." James Mitchell, senior partner and Audrey's direct supervisor, nodded approvingly from his position near the window. The 15-year veteran of Whitmore Associates had mentored Audrey through her early years at the firm, and the pride in his weathered face was unmistakable. "The client feedback has been extraordinary," James added, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he consulted his tablet. Catherine Reed from Meridian specifically mentioned Audrey's ability to understand not just their business needs, but their corporate culture and long-term vision. That's the kind of relationship building that creates lifetime partnerships. Audrey felt warmth spread through her chest, not just from the recognition, but from the genuine appreciation in James's voice. He had been the one constant supporter throughout her journey from junior analyst to senior strategist, the one who had seen her potential when others had questioned whether someone from her background could thrive in this rarefied corporate atmosphere. From the corner of her eye, Audrey caught sight of Sarah Chen, her junior analyst and closest friend at the firm, beaming with unmistakable pride. Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, her dark eyes bright with the kind of admiration that reminded Audrey why she had chosen to mentor the brilliant young graduate. Sarah represented everything Audrey believed about merit-based success: intelligence, dedication, and integrity over connections and privilege. "The synergies with our existing client base are remarkable," Audrey continued, clicking to her next slide. "Meridian's sustainability initiatives complement the operational efficiency work we're doing with Henderson Corp., while their supply chain innovations align perfectly with the technology implementations at Blackstone Financial. We're not just managing separate accounts, we're orchestrating an ecosystem of Fortune 500 excellence." As she spoke, Audrey's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of colleagues who had become her professional family. This was her element, the intersection of strategy, relationship building, and genuine value creation. She had always believed that business at its core was about understanding people and helping them achieve their goals. Every late night spent crafting proposals, every client dinner where she had listened more than she spoke, every follow-up call to check on implementation progress, It had all led to this moment of recognition. But then her eyes fell on a figure at the back of the room, partially obscured by shadows despite the bright morning light. Madison Whitmore sat with her arms crossed, her designer blazer impeccably tailored, but her expression anything but congratulatory. The CEO's daughter had been appointed vice president of client relations just 3 months ago, a move that had surprised many in the firm given her limited experience and questionable track record at her previous company. Where others in the room radiated warmth and celebration, Madison's presence felt cold, calculating. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed silently against her crossed arms, and her blue eyes, so similar to her father's yet lacking their warmth, fixed on Audrey with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the celebratory atmosphere. Audrey had always prided herself on reading people, on understanding the unspoken dynamics that drove business relationships. But Madison remained an enigma, someone whose motivations seemed driven by forces that had nothing to do with the merit-based world Audrey inhabited. There was something in Madison's stare that made Audrey's stomach tighten, a recognition of a different kind of ambition, one that operated by rules Audrey had never learned because she had never needed to. The integration timeline is aggressive but achievable, Audrey continued, forcing herself to focus on her presentation rather than the unsettling energy from the back of the room. Based on our success metrics with similar implementations, we're projecting a 15% efficiency improvement within the first quarter, with sustained growth tracking toward their 3-year goals. Robert Whitmore stood, his commanding presence immediately focusing the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what excellence looks like. Audrey has not only delivered exceptional results, she's demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and client relationship management that defines our firm's reputation. He paused, his eyes finding Audrey's with unmistakable approval. This deserves serious consideration for advancement within our partnership track. The words hung in the air like a promise, and Audrey felt her heart race with possibilities she had dreamed about since her first day at the firm. Partnership meant security, recognition, and the ability to shape the firm's future direction. It meant her parents' sacrifices, working double shifts to help her through business school, had been worthwhile. It meant proving that talent and dedication could overcome any background. James Mitchell stepped forward, his smile genuine and warm. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you this week, Audrey. There are some exciting developments we should discuss regarding your future here. The words were professional, but his tone carried the weight of significant opportunity. As colleagues began to file out of the boardroom offering congratulations and handshakes, Sarah Chen approached with barely contained excitement. Audrey, this is incredible. Partnership track. Do you realize what this means? Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Audrey of her own excitement when she had first glimpsed the possibilities that corporate success could offer. It means the real work is just beginning, Audrey replied, but she couldn't suppress her smile. These clients aren't just contracts, they're relationships that need constant nurturing. The responsibility is enormous, but even as she spoke with Sarah, Audrey's peripheral vision caught Madison Whitmore approaching her father near the exit. The brief exchange between father and daughter was too quiet to overhear, but the intensity in Madison's posture and the sudden shift in Robert's expression suggested a conversation far removed from the celebratory mood that had dominated the room. Madison's voice, when it finally carried across the space, was pitched with the kind of controlled urgency that demanded immediate attention. Dad, I need to speak with you privately. It's about strategic considerations for the firm that can't wait. Robert Whitmore's eyes flickered between his daughter and Audrey, and for a moment, something like uncertainty crossed his features. The confident CEO who had just celebrated unprecedented success suddenly looked like a father caught between competing loyalties. Of course, Madison, Robert said, his voice losing some of its earlier warmth. My office in 10 minutes. As the boardroom emptied, Audrey began packing her laptop and presentation materials, her mind already shifting to the client calls and strategy sessions that would consume her afternoon. She had 6 Fortune 500 clients counting on her expertise, and she never took that responsibility lightly. Success, she had learned, was not a destination but a daily commitment to excellence. Sarah lingered, organizing her notes with the meticulous care that made her such a valuable analyst. "I've been thinking about the cross-client synergies you mentioned," she said. "There might be opportunities for collaborative initiatives that could benefit all 6 accounts simultaneously." "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates good consultants from great ones," Audrey replied, her voice carrying the warmth of a mentor who genuinely invested in her protégé's development. "Let's schedule time tomorrow to explore those connections." But as they prepared to leave the boardroom, Audrey couldn't shake the memory of Madison's stare or the subtle shift in Robert Whitmore's demeanor. In her 5 years at the firm, she had navigated challenges through preparation, competence, and genuine relationship building. She had always believed that merit would prevail, that hard work and results would speak louder than politics or privilege. As she walked toward the elevator, laptop bag slung over her shoulder and mind already focused on her next client call, Audrey remained unaware that her greatest professional triumph had just set in motion, forces that would challenge everything she believed about fairness, merit, and the true nature of corporate success. The celebration was over, but the real test was about to begin. Madison Whitmore's heels clicked against the marble floor with the sharp precision of someone accustomed to commanding attention through presence alone. As she strode toward her father's corner office, her reflection in the polished surfaces seemed to multiply her determination, creating an army of perfectly coiffed ambition, marching toward a singular goal. The celebratory atmosphere from the boardroom felt like a distant memory, replaced by the cold calculation that had guided every major decision in her privileged life. Robert Whitmore's office occupied the northwestern corner of the 42nd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Chicago's business district. The space was a monument to 3 decades of corporate success, leather-bound books, crystal awards and photographs documenting the growth of Whitmore Associates from startup to industry leader. But as Madison entered without knocking, the usual sense of inherited pride felt tainted by something more urgent. "Dad, we need to talk about Audrey Brown," Madison said, closing the door behind her with deliberate firmness. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit, instead positioning herself across from her father's mahogany desk like a prosecutor preparing to present evidence. Robert looked up from the quarterly reports he'd been reviewing, his reading glasses catching the afternoon light. "Madison, if this is about recognition, I think the firm has been very clear about this isn't about recognition," Madison interrupted, her voice carrying the edge that had served her well in private school debates and corporate negotiations. "This is about protecting what you've built, what we've built." She leaned forward, her blue eyes so similar to her father's yet lacking their warmth fixed with laser intensity. "Audrey Brown is becoming a problem." Robert set down his glasses, the gesture slow and deliberate. In 30 years of building this company, he had learned to recognize genuine threats from petty grievances, but something in his daughter's tone demanded attention. "Audrey just delivered our most successful quarter in company history. 6 Fortune 500 clients in 8 months is unprecedented." "Exactly," Madison said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she had perfected during her MBA program at Wharton. "She's becoming the face of this company. Clients are asking for her specifically, partners are talking about her like she's some kind of consulting savant. Do you realize what that means for our family legacy?" The word legacy hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Robert felt in his chest. He had always envisioned Madison eventually taking over the firm, continuing the Whitmore name into the next generation. But recently, doubts had begun to creep in. Small observations about his daughter's approach to client relationships, her tendency to rely on politics rather than performance, her visible discomfort when faced with colleagues who genuinely excelled at their craft. "Madison, Audrey's success benefits everyone," Robert said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Her client portfolio alone represents nearly 40% of our annual revenue, and that's exactly the problem," Madison replied, standing and moving to the window overlooking the city. "She's making herself indispensable. Clients aren't loyal to Whitmore Associates, they're loyal to Audrey Brown." "What happens when she decides she wants equity, when she demands a partnership, when she realizes she could take those clients any?" Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced during the company's early years when every decision felt like it could make or break everything he'd worked for. Madison was articulating fears he hadn't wanted to acknowledge, the possibility that his greatest asset could become his greatest threat. "We need to address this before it becomes critical," Madison continued, her reflection in the window showing a smile that didn't reach her eye. "Corporate restructuring happens all the time. We could realign her compensation package, redistribute some of her responsibilities, show her that individual achievement needs to serve the greater good of the firm." The euphemisms came easily to Madison, corporate speak that transformed malicious intent into strategic necessity. She had learned this language in business school, perfected it during her brief tenure at her previous firm before joining Whitmore Associates. It was the vocabulary of institutional power protecting itself against individual excellence. "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert asked, though something in his gut already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Madison turned from the window, her expression shifting to the serious demeanor she reserved for her most important presentation. "We restructure her position, cut her salary significantly, say 50 to 60%, under the guise of moving toward a more team-based compensation model. We redistribute her major accounts to other managers who understand the importance of institutional loyalty." "Madison," that Robert began, but his daughter pressed on. "We frame it as organizational maturity," she said, moving back to the chair, across from his desk. "Individual star performers create instability. Clients need to understand they're working with Whitmore & Associates, not Audrey Brown personally. It's about protecting our reputation and ensuring sustainable growth." Robert stared at his daughter, seeing in her face an echo of his own ambition from decades earlier, but distorted by something he didn't recognize. When he had built this company, he had competed on merit, won clients through superior service, grown through authentic value creation. Madison's proposal felt like something else entirely, the use of institutional power to suppress rather than elevate excellence. "Who would take over her accounts?" he asked, the question emerging despite his growing discomfort. "Thomas Anderson has been eager to expand his portfolio," Madison replied without hesitation. "He understands the importance of team dynamics and institutional loyalty. He won't create the kind of cult of personality that threatens our corporate structure." Thomas Anderson. Robert knew him as an adequate account manager with political instincts that occasionally overshadowed his consulting skill. He was competent but unremarkable, ambitious but unthreatening, exactly the kind of employee who would never challenge the established order or make the founder's daughter feel inadequate by comparison. "Madison, I'm not sure this is the right approach," Robert said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. "Dad," Madison said, her tone shifting to something more personal, more vulnerable. "I know you want what's best for the company, but sometimes protecting what matters most requires difficult decisions. Audrey Brown is talented, but she's also dangerous. She makes other people feel inadequate. She creates division. She threatens the collaborative culture you've spent 30 years building." Each accusation was carefully crafted, designed to reframe Audrey's strengths as institutional weaknesses. Madison had studied her target, understanding that the most effective attacks came disguised as concern for the greater good. Robert felt the weight of 3 decades pressing down on him, every risk taken, every sacrifice made, every dream invested in building something lasting. The possibility that it could all be threatened by an employee, no matter how talented, triggered protective instincts that overrode his sense of fairness. "What about James Mitchell?" Robert asked. "He won't support this kind of restructuring." "James is a company man," Madison replied smoothly. "He'll understand the necessity once we explain the strategic reasoning. And if he doesn't, well, there are other positions for people who can't adapt to organizational evolution." The implicit threat hung between them. And Robert realized his daughter had thought through every angle, anticipated every objection. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to Audrey's success. It was a calculated campaign to eliminate a perceived threat. "I'll need to think about this," Robert said finally, though they both knew the battle for his conscience was already lost. Madison smiled, the expression finally reaching her eyes. "Of course, Dad, but don't think too long. The longer we wait, the more entrenched she becomes, the more difficult it will be to make the necessary changes. As Madison left his office, Robert stared out at the Chicago skyline, seeing in its gleaming towers a reflection of his own ambitions and compromise. Somewhere in the building below, Audrey Brown was probably on a client call, delivering the kind of excellence that had built his company's reputation. But excellence, he was beginning to understand, could be as threatening as it was valuable. The poisoning had begun, and like all the most effective toxins, it would work slowly, invisibly, until the damage was irreversible. 3 days after the boardroom celebration that should have secured her future, Audrey Brown walked into the same conference room, expecting her career to take its next logical step forward. The morning sun cast the same golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but something felt different. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't quite identify. James Mitchell's meeting request had been formal but promising. Strategic discussion regarding your position and future contributions to the firm. Audrey had spent the previous evening reviewing her client portfolios, preparing talking points about expansion opportunities, and mentally rehearsing her vision for the next phase of her career. Partnership had felt within reach, a culmination of 5 years of dedication and unprecedented results. She entered the boardroom with the confident stride of someone who had earned her place at the table through merit and hard work. But as she stepped through the doorway, her confidence wavered. Instead of James waiting alone for their one-on-one discussion, she found herself facing a tribunal. Madison Whitmore sat at the head of the table where Audrey had delivered her triumphant presentation just days earlier, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes carrying a cold satisfaction. Robert Whitmore occupied his usual position to Madison's right, though he seemed unable to meet Audrey's gaze directly. James Mitchell stood near the windows, his normally warm demeanor replaced by something that looked disturbingly like defeat. "Audrey, please sit down," Madison said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "We have some important developments to discuss regarding your role here at Whitmore Associates. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The word developments sent a chill through Audrey's chest. In her experience, corporate developments rarely favored the employee when delivered with such formal gravity. She took her seat across from Madison, her mind racing to understand why a promotion discussion required such an elaborate setup. "As you know," Madison continued, consulting a folder of documents that Audrey hadn't seen before, "our firm has always prided itself on collaborative excellence and institutional stability. Recent organizational analysis has identified some areas where individual performance patterns may be creating unintended consequences for our team-based culture." Audrey felt her stomach drop as Madison's words registered. The corporate euphemisms were unmistakable. This wasn't a promotion discussion. This was something else entirely, something that made her mouth go dry with growing dread. "I'm sorry," Audrey said, her voice steady despite the panic building in her chest, "but I thought this meeting was about advancement opportunities. James, you mentioned strategic considerations for my future here." James Mitchell turned from the window, his face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide his obvious discomfort. "Audrey, the strategy we're discussing involves realigning your compensation and responsibilities to better serve the firm's long-term interest." The words hit her like physical blows. Compensation realignment, responsibility redistribution. She had heard these phrases before, usually in the context of employees being managed out or demoted, but this was impossible. She had just delivered the most successful quarter in company history. "I don't understand," Audrey said, looking between the 3 faces across from her. "My performance metrics are unprecedented. Client satisfaction scores are the highest in firm history. Revenue attribution exceeds every previous benchmark." Madison's smile was razor-thin, carrying the satisfaction of someone delivering a carefully orchestrated blow. "Individual performance is just one factor in organizational decision-making, Audrey. We've identified some concerning patterns in your client relationships that suggest overdependence on personal connections rather than institutional loyalty." Overdependence. Audrey's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. "Those relationships generated $42 million in new business. Those clients trust me because I deliver results." "Exactly," Madison replied, her tone suggesting that Audrey had just proven her point. Clients should trust Whitmore Associates as an institution, not individual consultants. We've decided to restructure your position to address this organizational vulnerability. Robert Whitmore finally spoke, his voice lacking the warmth that had characterized their previous interaction. Effective immediately, your salary will be adjusted to reflect a more collaborative compensation model. The new structure represents a 58% reduction from your current base, with opportunities for team-based performance bonuses. The number hit Audrey like a physical assault. 58%. More than half her income, gone. The mortgage on her small condo, the payments on her student loans, the modest emergency fund she had finally managed to build. All of it suddenly in jeopardy because of organizational analysis and collaborative compensation model. This has to be a mistake, Audrey said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're cutting my salary by more than half after I delivered the best quarter in company history. Madison leaned forward, her expression shifting to something resembling sympathy that felt more insulting than outright hostility. We understand this is difficult, Audrey. Change always is, but sometimes individual interests need to be subordinated to institutional needs. Your client relationships have created an unsustainable dependency that threatens our organizational stability. What client relationships? Audrey demanded, her shock transforming into righteous anger. Professional relationships built on competence and result. Partnerships that generate millions in revenue. How exactly does success threaten stability? Thomas Anderson will be taking over as lead on your major accounts, Madison continued, ignoring Audrey's question. He has extensive experience with institutional client management and understands the importance of maintaining proper boundaries between personal achievement and corporate objectives. Thomas Anderson, the name landed like a final insult. Audrey knew Thomas as an adequate but unremarkable account manager, whose primary skill seemed to be navigating office politics rather than delivering client value. The idea that her carefully cultivated relationships with Fortune 500 executives would be handed over to someone whose greatest achievement was avoiding controversy felt like a violation of everything she believed about merit-based success. The conference room door opened, and James Mitchell entered with obvious reluctance. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked disturbingly like defeat, and when his eyes met Audrey's, she saw an apology he couldn't voice in a room dominated by Madison's orchestrated cruelty. James, Audrey said, her voice carrying a desperate hope that her mentor and advocate would provide some explanation that made sense of this nightmare. You said this was about strategic planning for my future. This can't be what you meant. James's silence stretched for long seconds before he finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. The decision has been made at the executive level, Audrey. I was brought in to help communicate the transition plan. The betrayal cut deeper than the salary reduction. James Mitchell had been her champion, her mentor, the one person in the firm's leadership she had trusted completely. Seeing him reduced to a messenger for Madison's machinations felt like watching everything she believed about loyalty and principle crumble in real time. I want to see the documentation, Audrey said, her shock crystallizing into cold determination. Performance reviews, client feedback, whatever analysis supports these accusations about my work. Madison's smile widened slightly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. All personnel decisions are confidential and based on proprietary organizational assessments. The restructuring is final and effective immediately. This is illegal, Audrey said, standing abrupt. Arbitrary salary reductions, false performance accusations, retaliation for success. I'll file complaints with HR, with the labor board, with whoever will listen. HR has already reviewed and approved the restructuring, Robert Whitmore said quietly, his first words since announcing the salary cut. The decision was made through proper channels with appropriate oversight. The casual mention of HR approval felt like the final nail in a carefully constructed coffin. Audrey realized that this wasn't a spontaneous decision or a misguided attempt at organizational improvement. This was a systematic campaign designed to destroy her career, orchestrated with enough corporate legitimacy to avoid legal challenges. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the conference room that had once represented the pinnacle of her professional achievement, Audrey Brown felt something fundamental shift inside her. The naive belief that merit would always prevail, that hard work would be rewarded, that excellence would speak for itself. All of it crumbled under the weight of institutional betrayal. But beneath the shock and devastation, something else was beginning to take shape. A cold, calculating anger that would soon transform from righteous indignation into strategic action. Madison Whitmore had just made the most expensive mistake of her privileged life. The elevator doors closed with mechanical finality, sealing Audrey Brown into a chrome and mirror prison that reflected her shattered composure from every angle. Her hands trembled as she pressed the button for the 37th floor, where her office waited like a sanctuary she wasn't sure she deserved anymore. The descent felt endless, each floor marking another second of growing comprehension that her professional life had just been deliberately destroyed by people she had trusted. 58%, the number echoed in her mind with the persistence of physical pain. More than half her income vanished in a conference room where she had expected celebration. The mortgage payment, due next week, her parents' medical bills she had quietly been helping with, the student loan payments that still consumed a significant portion of her budget, all of it suddenly precarious because Madison Whitmore had decided her success was threatening. As the elevator opened onto her floor, Audrey forced herself to walk normally past the curious glances of colleagues who had heard whispers about the morning's meeting. The open-plan workspace buzzed with the usual energy of a successful consulting firm, but it felt alien now, like visiting a place where she no longer belonged. Her corner office, earned through 5 years of exceptional performance, seemed smaller somehow, tainted by the knowledge that it could be taken away as arbitrarily as everything else. She closed her door and sank into her chair, staring at the client files spread across her desk. 6 Fortune 500 companies that had chosen to work with Whitmore Associates specifically because of her strategic insights and relationship-building skills. Companies that would now be told their trusted advisor was being replaced by Thomas Anderson, a man whose greatest consulting achievement was avoiding controversial decisions. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Sarah Chen entered without waiting for permission, her usually bright expression clouded with concern. "Audrey, I heard about the meeting. Are you okay?" The simple question nearly broke through Audrey's carefully maintained composure. Sarah represented everything she had believed about merit-based success: brilliant, dedicated, and idealistic enough to believe that excellence would always be rewarded. How could she explain that the system they both trusted had just revealed itself to be a carefully constructed illusion? "They cut my salary by 58%, Audrey said, her voice eerily calm. "Effective immediately. They're redistributing my accounts to Thomas Anderson, because my client relationships are apparently too personal and threaten institutional stability." Sarah's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally anger. "That's insane. You just brought in $42 million in new business. Your client satisfaction scores are the highest in firm history. How is that threatening anything?" "Because Madison Whitmore feels threatened," Audrey replied, surprised by the clarity that was emerging from her initial shock. "And Madison Whitmore is being groomed to inherit this company. Excellence that highlights her mediocrity becomes a problem to be solved rather than an asset to be celebrated." The words felt bitter but true. For 5 years, Audrey had operated under the assumption that competence would speak for itself, that results would guarantee recognition, that hard work would inevitably lead to advancement. Madison's calculated destruction of her career had revealed the naive optimism underlying those beliefs. Another knock at the door made both women turn. James Mitchell entered, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked like deep personal pain. The man who had mentored Audrey through her early years at the firm, who had championed her promotions and celebrated her successes, now looked like someone forced to participate in something that violated his core principle. "Audrey, I need to explain," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You don't need to explain anything, James," she said, though her voice carried more sadness than anger. "You were put in an impossible position. I understand." James closed the door behind him and moved to the chair across from her desk, the same seat where they had conducted countless strategy sessions and career development conversations. "No, you don't understand. What happened in that room was wrong. Madison orchestrated this entire thing, and her father went along with it because he's too afraid to confront her about her inadequacies. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Audrey realized that James was risking his own position by speaking so openly. "Then why didn't you fight for me?" she asked, though the question came out more curious than accusatory. "Because I'm 53 years old with a mortgage, 2 kids in college, and 15 years invested in a pension plan," James said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the cost of his compromise. "Because Madison made it clear that opposing this decision would result in my own restructuring. Because I'm not brave enough to sacrifice my family's security for principle, even though I know what's happening to you is unconscionable." The honesty was devastating in its self-awareness. James Mitchell was a good man caught in a corrupt system, forced to choose between his conscience and his survival. Audrey found herself feeling sorry for him even as she recognized that his moral cowardice had enabled her destruction. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she moved closer to Audrey's desk. "I've been doing some digging into the decision-making process. The timeline doesn't make sense. Madison started building a case against you weeks ago, long before your latest client success. This wasn't a reaction to your achievement, it was planned in advance." The revelation hit Audrey like a physical blow. Her destruction hadn't been a spontaneous response to jealousy. It had been a premeditated campaign designed to eliminate a perceived threat. Madison had been systematically building documentation, manufacturing justifications, and constructing corporate cover for what amounted to professional assassination. "What kind of documentation?" Audrey asked, her shock crystallizing into cold calculation. "Performance concerns that were never discussed with you," Sarah continued, glancing nervously at the closed door. "Client relationship issues that contradict every feedback form in your file, accusations about team collaboration that directly conflict with peer review." She created an entire parallel narrative about your work that bears no resemblance to reality. James leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "Sarah's right. I was asked to contribute to a performance assessment that I knew was fabricated. When I refused, Madison suggested that my judgment might be compromised by personal loyalty to you. The implication was clear: participate in destroying your reputation or face consequences myself." Audrey stared at her mentor, seeing in his defeated expression the true scope of Madison's manipulation. This wasn't just about salary cuts and account redistribution. This was about character assassination, about destroying her professional reputation so thoroughly that recovery would be impossible. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She glanced at the screen and froze. "Call me when you get a chance. We should talk about what happened today." David Harrison, the independent consultant she had met briefly at an industry conference 3 months earlier. Someone who had left the corporate world to build his own practice, who had spoken passionately about the freedom that came with authentic client relationships unburdened by institutional politics. Someone who might understand what she was going through. "I need to make a phone call," Audrey said, her voice carrying new determination. "Sarah, can you document everything you've found? Times, dates, inconsistencies in the record?" "James, I know you're in a difficult position, but if you have any copies of the real performance data, I'd appreciate access to it." Both of them nodded, understanding that they were crossing lines that might have professional consequence. But something in Audrey's demeanor had shifted from shocked victim to strategic thinker, from someone reacting to circumstances to someone preparing to take control of her own narrative. As her colleagues left the office, Audrey sat alone with the growing realization that Madison Whitmore had just made a critical miscalculation. By attacking her so blatantly, by involving James and Sarah in the conspiracy, by creating such obvious contradictions between reality and documentation, Madison had provided the very evidence that could expose the entire scheme. The 58% salary cut was devastating, but it wasn't final. The account redistributions were insulting, but clients ultimately chose who they wanted to work with. The character assassination was painful, but truth had a way of emerging when people started asking the right questions. Audrey picked up her phone to call David Harrison, her finger hovering over the number as she contemplated a conversation that might change everything. The naive believer in corporate meritocracy was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real success might require stepping outside the system entirely. The reckoning within was complete. Now it was time to begin the reckoning without. The phone felt heavy in Audrey's hand as she dialed David Harrison's number, her finger hovering over the final digit as she contemplated a conversation that might change everything. But before she could complete the call, her office phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated an external client line. Catherine Reed's name appeared on the caller ID, and Audrey felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "Catherine," Audrey answered, forcing warmth into her voice despite the turmoil churning inside her. "How are you?" "I'm confused as hell. If you want the truth." Catherine Reed's voice carried the sharp edge that had made her one of the most feared and respected CEOs in manufacturing. "I just got off a call with someone named Thomas Anderson who claims he's taking over our account. Care to explain what's happening over there?" The directness was classic Catherine. No corporate pleasantries, no dancing around uncomfortable topics. It was one of the qualities that had made their business relationship so effective. And now it felt like a lifeline in the chaos that had consumed Audrey's day. "Whitmore Associates has decided to restructure my role," Audrey said carefully, aware that any hint of bitterness or criticism could reflect poorly on her professionalism. "Thomas will be handling several accounts moving forward while I transition to different responsibilities within the firm." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Audrey to wonder if the call had been dropped. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice carried a coldness that Audrey had never heard directed at her before. "That's corporate bullshit, and we both know it," Catherine said bluntly. "I've worked with you for 8 months. I know your capabilities, your attention to detail, your understanding of our business challenges. Now they want to hand me off to someone whose first question was whether we had considered optimizing synergistic operational frameworks. What the hell does that even mean?" Despite everything, Audrey found herself smiling at Catherine's characterization of Thomas Anderson's consulting speech. "I'm sure Thomas will provide excellent service," she said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "Don't patronize me, Audrey," Catherine replied sharply. "I didn't build a $3 billion company by accepting excellent service when I know I can get exceptional results. Whatever political game is being played over there, I want you to know that Meridian Industries works with people we trust, not institutions that make arbitrary decisions about our business relationships." The words hit Audrey with unexpected force. Throughout her morning of shock and betrayal, she had focused on what was being taken from her: salary, accounts, recognition, security. But Catherine's response highlighted something she hadn't fully considered. The clients themselves had voices in this process, choices that couldn't be controlled by Madison's machinations. "I appreciate your confidence," Audrey said, her voice growing stronger. "The work we've done together means a great deal to me, regardless of how the business relationship evolves." "Evolves?" Catherine's laugh carried no humor. "Audrey, I'm going to be very clear about something. Meridian Industries contracted with Whitmore Associates because of your strategic insights, your understanding of our corporate culture, your ability to translate complex operational challenges into actionable solutions. If you're not leading our account, then we need to seriously reconsider our consulting partnership." The implication hung in the air, like a promise and a threat simultaneously. Catherine Reed was essentially offering Audrey something Madison had tried to destroy: proof that her value transcended institutional politics, that real business relationships were built on competence and trust rather than corporate hierarchy. Audrey's second line began ringing insistently, and she glanced at the caller ID to see another Fortune 500 client. "Catherine, I need to take another call, but I want you to know how much I value our working relationship. Whatever happens, I'm committed to ensuring you get the support you need." "We'll talk soon," Catherine said, and the promise in her voice carried weight that made Audrey's pulse quicken. The next call was from Marcus Thompson, CEO of Henderson Corporation, and his concern mirrored Catherine. Then Jennifer Walsh from Blackstone Financial, expressing bewilderment at the sudden account transition. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial confusion, growing skepticism about Thomas Anderson's qualifications, and barely concealed frustration with Whitmore Associates' decision-making process. By the time Audrey finished her fifth client call of the afternoon, A pattern had emerged that would have been encouraging if it weren't so professionally dangerous. Every single Fortune 500 executive had questioned the logic of the transition, expressed confidence in her abilities, and suggested that their continued relationship with Whitmore and Associates depended heavily on her involvement in their account. Sarah Chen appeared in her doorway, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "I've been monitoring the client calls coming through the main line," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "3 different companies have asked to speak with senior management about account transitions. Madison is starting to panic." "Panic?" Audrey asked, though she felt a grim satisfaction at the word. She called an emergency meeting with Thomas to prepare him for client relationship challenges. Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But based on the reports I'm hearing, Thomas is completely overwhelmed. He's never handled accounts of this complexity, and it's shown." As if summoned by their conversation, Audrey's phone rang again. This time it was David Harrison's number, the call she had been preparing to make before Catherine Reed had initiated what was becoming an afternoon of revelation. "David," she answered, stepping away from Sarah to take the call privately. "Audrey, I heard through the consulting grapevine that something significant happened at Whitmore and Associates today." David's voice carried the calm confidence that had impressed her during their brief meeting months earlier. "I wanted to reach out and see if you might want to grab coffee. Sometimes it helps to talk through these situations with someone who's been through similar transitions." Transitions was a diplomatic way to describe what felt like professional assassination, but Audrey appreciated David's tactful approach. "I think I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "There's a coffee shop called Grind on Michigan Avenue, about 6 blocks from your building. Could you meet there in an hour?" After confirming the meeting, Audrey turned back to Sarah, who had been discreetly reviewing emails on her phone. "More client feedback?" Audrey asked. "Actually, something more interesting," Sarah replied, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "I've been tracking the internal communications about your account transitions." Madison sent a memo to all department heads, explaining that client concerns are temporary adjustment reactions that will resolve once proper institutional relationships are established. Meaning she thinks she can wait out the client complaints, that eventually everyone will accept the new arrangements because they have to, Sarah explained. But she's miscalculating something fundamental about business relationships. These aren't just service contracts, they're partnerships built on personal trust and proven competence. Audrey felt something shifting inside her, a recognition that Madison's greatest strength, her understanding of institutional power, might also be her greatest weakness. Madison thought in terms of corporate hierarchies and structural authority, but business relationships, especially at the Fortune 500 level, operated on different principles entirely. "Sarah, I want you to document every client interaction from today," Audrey said, her voice carrying new determination. "Times concerns expressed, specific comments about Thomas Anderson's capability. If this situation continues to escalate, we're going to need a clear record of what actually happened versus what Madison claims happened." As Sarah nodded and gathered her materials, Audrey realized that her afternoon of client calls had fundamentally altered her understanding of her situation. Madison had assumed that controlling Audrey's position would automatically transfer her client relationships. But client loyalty, Audrey was discovering, couldn't be reassigned through corporate restructuring. She gathered her things and prepared to leave for her meeting with David Harrison, her mind racing with possibilities she hadn't considered that morning. The naive belief in corporate meritocracy was gone, replaced by something more strategic, more aware of the complex dynamics that really drove business success. As she walked toward the elevator, Audrey caught sight of Madison through the glass walls of a conference room, gesticulating emphatically at Thomas Anderson while her father sat nearby looking increasingly uncomfortable. The scene would have intimidated her this morning, but now it looked different, like someone realizing that institutional power had limits when confronted with authentic business relationships. The elevator doors closed, carrying her toward a conversation that might reshape her understanding of what professional success could look like outside the constraints of corporate politics. Madison Whitmore was about to learn that client loyalty couldn't be commanded through org charts and salary structures. It had to be earned, one relationship at a time. The coffee shop on Michigan Avenue buzzed with the afternoon energy of Chicago's business district, but David Harrison had chosen a corner table that offered privacy despite the surrounding conversation. Audrey spotted him immediately, the same confident bearing she remembered from their brief industry conference encounter, now tempered with something that looked like genuine concern. As she approached, he stood with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed rare in corporate environments. "Audrey," he said, extending his hand with a firm grip that somehow conveyed both professionalism and warmth. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice. I can only imagine what kind of day you've had." "That's an understatement," Audrey replied, settling into the chair across from him. The normalcy of ordering coffee felt surreal after a morning of systematic betrayal, but David's presence carried a calm that she hadn't realized she desperately needed. "Before we talk about anything else," David said after they'd ordered, "I want you to know that what happened to you today is already becoming industry gossip. Word travels fast in consulting circles, especially when it involves Fortune 500 account transitions happening without client consultation." The revelation that her professional destruction was already public knowledge should have been mortifying, but instead Audrey felt something like relief. "What exactly are people saying?" "That Catherine Reed called 3 different consulting firms this afternoon, asking about their availability for a major manufacturing strategy project," David replied, his eyes steady on her. "That Henderson Corporation's CEO personally contacted Whitmore Associates board members to express concerns about service continuity. That Madison Whitmore spent 2 hours in damage control meetings trying to explain why their most successful account manager was suddenly being restructured." Each piece of information hit Audrey like validation, confirmation that her morning's conversations had consequences beyond her own situation. The clients she had served with dedication and excellence were refusing to accept Madison's arbitrary decisions, creating exactly the kind of institutional crisis that Madison had accused Audrey of threatening. "David, can I ask you something?" Audrey said, leaning forward slightly. "When you left your previous firm to start your own practice, how did you know it was the right decision?" David's smile carried the weight of someone who had faced similar crossroads. "Because I realized I was spending more energy navigating office politics than serving my client. Because I understood that my value didn't come from the name on my business cards, but from the relationships I'd built and the results I could deliver." He paused, studying her expression. "And because I recognized that some systems are so fundamentally corrupt that working within them makes you complicit in your own professional destruction." The words resonated with painful accuracy. Audrey had spent 5 years believing that excellence within the system would eventually be rewarded, that corporate meritocracy was real if you just worked hard enough to prove your worth. Madison's betrayal had shattered that illusion, but David's perspective offered something else, the possibility that leaving the system might be liberation rather than defeat. "What would that look like practically?" she asked, though even voicing the question felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. "It would look like Brown and Harrison Consulting," David said simply. "It would look like taking your Fortune 500 relationships and the expertise you've developed, and building something that operates on principles of competence and integrity rather than nepotism and office politics." The proposal hung in the air between them, audacious and terrifying and somehow inevitable. Partnership with David would mean abandoning the security of institutional employment, but it would also mean freedom from the kind of systemic betrayal she had experienced that morning. "The clients would follow," David continued, his voice carrying quiet confidence. "Not because we'd steal them, but because authentic business relationships transcend corporate boundaries. Catherine Reed doesn't want to work with Whitmore Associates, she wants to work with you. The same is true for your other Fortune 500 accounts." Before Audrey could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Sarah, Madison spreading rumors about client poaching and unethical business practices. "She's escalating, be careful." The message confirmed what Audrey had begun to suspect. Madison's desperation was leading to increasingly reckless behavior. Faced with the possibility that her plan had backfired spectacularly, Madison was doubling down with character assassination designed to destroy Audrey's reputation beyond recovery. "There's something else you need to know," Audrey said, showing David the text. "Madison isn't just trying to damage my position within the firm, she's launching a campaign to destroy my professional reputation entirely." David's expression darkened as he read the message. "That's a dangerous game she's playing. False accusations about client poaching can have legal implications, especially when they're demonstrably untrue. But it also suggests she's panicking, making moves based on emotion rather than strategy. What do you mean? I mean that someone confident in their position doesn't resort to character assassination, David explained. Madison's escalation suggests that the client pushback is more severe than she anticipated, that her father and the bird are asking questions she can't answer satisfactorily. Audrey's phone rang, and James Mitchell's name appeared on the display. She answered immediately, recognizing the urgency in the ring pattern. "Audrey, where are you?" James's voice carried stress that bordered on panic. "Madison is calling an emergency partners meeting to discuss client security protocols and employee loyalty concerns. She's preparing to present documentation about your supposed misconduct." "What kind of documentation?" Audrey asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The fabricated performance issues Sarah discovered, but now reframed as evidence of client manipulation and potential breach of fiduciary duty," James replied. "She's trying to build a case that your client relationships constitute unethical business practices that threaten the firm's reputation." The audacity was breathtaking. Madison was attempting to transform Audrey's greatest professional strength, her ability to build authentic client relationships, into evidence of misconduct. It was a strategy that could only work if no one questioned the underlying assumptions or bothered to verify the documentation. "James, I need you to do something for me," Audrey said, her voice carrying new determination. "I need you to request copies of all performance documentation related to my employment. Tell them it's for transition planning purposes. Can you do that?" "Audrey, I'm not sure that's wise. If Madison suspects you're building a case, she's already destroyed my career," Audrey interrupted. "The only question now is whether I'm going to let her destroy my reputation too." After ending the call, Audrey turned back to David, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone who understood the stakes involved. "You're at a decision point," he said quietly. "You can try to fight this within the system, attempt to prove your innocence to people who have already decided you're guilty, or you can step outside the system entirely and prove your worth in a marketplace that values results over politics." The choice crystallized with startling clarity. Madison's escalation had eliminated the middle ground, made continued employment at Whitmore Associates impossible regardless of whether Audrey could prove her innocent. The question wasn't whether to leave, it was whether to leave as a victim of circumstance, or as someone taking control of her own destiny. "If I do this," Audrey said, "if I resign and start my own firm, Madison will claim it proves her accusation. She'll say I was planning to steal clients all along." "Let her," David replied. "Actions speak louder than accusation. When your new firm operates with transparency and integrity, when your client relationships flourish outside the toxic environment of Whitmore Associates, the truth will be self-evident." Audrey stared out the coffee shop window at the Chicago skyline, seeing in its gleaming towers a reflection of both ambition and possibility. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Madison Whitmore was probably preparing her character assassination, confident that institutional power would prevail over individual excellence. But institutional power, Audrey was beginning to understand, had limits. It could control salary structures and organizational charts, but it couldn't command client loyalty or manufacture competence. Madison had made a fundamental miscalculation, and now it was time to make her pay for it. "When would we start?" Audrey asked, the question emerging with surprising conviction. David's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who recognized a fellow fighter. "We start tomorrow, and we start by giving your clients exactly what they've been asking for: continuity of service from someone they trust." The point of no return had been reached. Now it was time to cross it. Audrey's resignation letter was deceptively simple: 3 paragraphs of professional courtesy that gave no hint of the corporate earthquake it would trigger. She had written it in her office at dawn, arriving before the building's security guards had finished their rounds, needing the solitude to craft words that would end one chapter of her life while beginning another. The letter cited strategic career opportunities and personal growth objectives, the kind of corporate euphemisms that concealed as much as they revealed. By 9 a.m., The letter sat on Robert Whitmore's desk while Audrey waited in the reception area outside his corner office. Through the glass walls, she could see him reading it with growing alarm, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked remarkably like panic. The man who had built an empire through calculated business decisions was discovering that some decisions carried consequences he hadn't anticipated. "Audrey, please come in." Robert's voice carried none of its usual commanding authority when he finally called her into his office. "I need to understand what's happening here. Yesterday we discussed restructuring your role and now you're submitting a resignation." "The restructuring made my position untenable," Audrey replied, taking the seat across from his desk with the calm composure of someone who had already accepted the inevitable. "A 58% salary reduction and the redistribution of my major accounts doesn't leave much room for the kind of work I'm passionate about." Robert stared at her for a long moment, perhaps seeing for the first time the disconnect between Madison's characterization of Audrey as a problematic employee and the accomplished professional sitting across from him. "We could reconsider some aspects of the restructure, perhaps find a middle ground that addresses everyone's concerns." The offer came too late and with too little conviction. Audrey recognized it as the desperate gambit of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "I appreciate the offer, but I've accepted a partnership opportunity that aligns better with my professional goals." Partnership? The word hit Robert like a physical blow. "With whom?" Before Audrey could answer, Madison burst through the office door without knocking, her face flushed with the kind of agitation that suggested she had been monitoring the situation from afar. "Dad, we need to talk about damage control." Catherine Reed just called to terminate Meridian Industries' contract effective immediately. The announcement hung in the air like a detonation, and Audrey watched Robert's face drain of color as the implications registered. Meridian Industries represented one of their largest accounts, a multi-million-dollar relationship that had taken months to cultivate and secure. "That's impossible," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have a 3-year agreement, which includes a 60-day termination clause for any reason," Madison replied, her eyes fixed on Audrey with undisguised fury. Reed specifically cited concerns about service continuity and account management changes. "She's demanding immediate transition of all work product and documentation." Audrey felt a surge of vindication mixed with professional satisfaction. Catherine Reed had done exactly what she had implied during their phone conversation, chosen competence over institutional loyalty, results over corporate politics. It was a decision that validated everything Audrey believed about authentic business relationships. "This is just the beginning," Madison continued, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. "Henderson Corporation scheduled an emergency meeting with their legal team. Blackstone Financial is demanding explanations about account transitions. Your little stunt is going to destroy client relationships we've spent years building." "My stunt?" Audrey's voice carried a dangerous calm. "You mean my resignation after you cut my salary by more than half and redistributed my accounts based on fabricated performance concerns? That stunt?" Robert held up a hand to forestall Madison's response, but the damage was already done. The truth was finally being spoken aloud in his office, and he could no longer pretend that Madison's actions had been justified by legitimate business concerns. James Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his expression gray. "Robert, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Marcus Thompson from Henderson Corporation is on line 1. He's demanding to speak with senior management about what he's calling unacceptable business practices." The corporate crisis was unfolding in real time, and Audrey realized she was witnessing the moment when Madison's carefully constructed narrative began to collapse under the weight of client reality. Fortune 500 executives didn't terminate multi-million-dollar consulting relationships lightly, and their collective response was sending a message that couldn't be ignored or reframed. "Take a message," Madison snapped at James. "Tell him we're reviewing account transition procedures, and we'll respond within 24 hours. He's not interested in messages," James replied quietly. "He wants answers now, or Henderson Corporation will be evaluating alternative consulting arrangements." The phone on Robert's desk began ringing insistently, and his assistant's voice came through the intercom with obvious stress. "Mr. Whitmore, Jennifer Walsh from Blackstone Financial is holding online too. She says it's urgent regarding their consulting agreement." Audrey watched the scene unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a slow-motion disaster. Madison's plan to neutralize her threat had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of institutional crisis that Madison had claimed to be prevented. The clients weren't just questioning account transitions, they were questioning the competence and integrity of Whitmore Associates management. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Madison said, turning to Audrey with unconcealed venom. "You orchestrated this whole thing. Client poaching, industrial sabotage, deliberate undermining of our business relationships." "I orchestrated nothing," Audrey replied evenly. "I simply resigned from a position that had become untenable. The fact that your clients are responding negatively to my departure might suggest that your assessment of my value to the firm was somewhat inaccurate." Robert's phone rang again, and this time he answered it himself. "Yes, Catherine, I understand your concerns, but perhaps we could discuss." His face fell as he listened to whatever Catherine Reed was saying on the other end of the line. "I see. Yes, I understand. We'll facilitate the transition as smoothly as possible." When he hung up, the silence in the room was deafening. Robert Whitmore, the man who had built his company through 3 decades of careful relationship building, looked like someone watching his life's work crumble in real time. "Catherine Reed has formally requested that all Meridian Industries work product be transferred to Brown & Harrison Consulting within 48 hours, he said quietly. "She's also indicated that she'll be recommending our Kemperding former arrangement to other executives in her network." The mention of Brown & Harrison Consulting confirmed what Madison had undoubtedly suspected. Audrey hadn't just resigned in anger. She had a specific plan and a new professional home. The partnership with David Harrison wasn't a desperate escape, it was a strategic decision that had been validated by the very clients Madison had tried to control. "You can't let her do this," Madison said, her voice carrying a desperation that Audrey had never heard before. "There have to be legal remedies, non-compete clauses, client confidentiality agreements, something that prevents this kind of client theft." "It's not client theft when the clients choose to leave voluntarily," James said quietly, speaking for the first time since delivering the message about Henderson Corporation. "And Audrey's employment contract doesn't include non-compete provisions for consulting work outside our geographic territory." The legal reality hit Madison like another blow, and Audrey realized that in her rush to destroy a perceived threat, Madison had failed to consider the practical implications of her action. By forcing Audrey out so abruptly and with such obvious injustice, she had created exactly the kind of situation that would motivate clients to follow their trusted advisor to a new firm. As the phones continued ringing and the crisis deepened, Audrey stood to leave. Her 2-week notice would be a formality. The exodus had already begun, and it would accelerate regardless of whether she remained in the building. The clients had made their choice, and it wasn't the choice Madison had anticipated. "This isn't over," Madison said as Audrey reached the door. "You'll never work in this industry again when we're finished documenting your unethical practices." Audrey turned back with a smile that carried no warmth. "Madison, I think you'll find that in consulting, success is measured by client satisfaction and results, not by threats and institutional politics. The market will decide who provides value and who doesn't." As she walked away from Robert Whitmore's office for the final time, Audrey could hear the phones ringing throughout the executive suite. The exodus had begun, and it would continue until Madison learned what Audrey had always known, that authentic business relationships couldn't be controlled through corporate structures or commanded through hierarchical authority. They had to be earned, and once earned, they belonged to the person who had created them. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 p.m. in Whitmore Associates' main conference room, the same space where Audrey Brown had delivered her triumphant presentation just 1 week earlier. Now the mahogany table was surrounded by grim-faced directors studying financial projections that painted a devastating picture of institutional collapse. In less than 48 hours, 5 of the firm's 6 largest Fortune 500 clients had either terminated their contracts or initiated formal reviews that would likely result in termination. Robert Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his usually commanding presence diminished by the weight of watching his life's work unravel in real time. The man who had built Whitmore Associates from a single-room startup into a prestigious consulting empire now faced the possibility that his own daughter had destroyed everything he had spent 30 years creating. "The numbers are stark," announced Margaret Sullivan, the firm's chief financial officer, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone delivering terminal diagnosis. Rebedian Industries, Henderson Corporation, Blackstone Financial, and Morrison Tech have formally terminated their consulting agreements. Stevens International has suspended all work pending a comprehensive review of service delivery standards. "We're looking at a revenue loss of approximately $63 million annually." The figure hung in the air like a death sentence. $63 million represented more than 40% of the firm's total revenue, enough to necessitate massive layoffs, office closures, and the kind of organizational restructuring that could permanently damage their market reputation. "How is this possible?" asked Richard Hayes, the longest-serving board member and Robert's former business partner. "These were stable, multi-year relationships. Fortune 500 companies don't terminate consulting agreements without cause." Robert's eyes found Madison, who sat rigidly at the far end of the table, her face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide the panic beneath. "Perhaps Madison can explain the sequence of events that led to this crisis," he said, his voice carrying a coldness that his daughter had never heard before. Madison straightened in her chair, drawing on the presentation skills that had served her well in business school but seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the current disaster. "The client departures are clearly coordinated retaliation, orchestrated by Audrey Brown. Her resignation was obviously planned in advance as part of a scheme to damage our firm and steal our clients for her new consulting venture." "Coordinated retaliation?" Margaret Sullivan's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Madison, these are Fortune 500 CEOs, not corporate conspirators. They don't coordinate anything without compelling business reasons." James Mitchell, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke from his position near the windows. "I think we need to examine the actual sequence of events rather than speculating about coordination." Audrey Brown was subjected to what can only be described as punitive treatment, despite delivering unprecedented results. Her salary was cut by 58%, her major accounts were redistributed to less experienced personnel, and she was essentially forced to resign under circumstances that any reasonable professional would find intolerable. The words carried the weight of moral authority that came from 15 years of service to the firm, and several board members shifted uncomfortably as the implications registered. James was essentially saying that Audrey's treatment had been so egregiously unfair that client departures were a predictable consequence rather than orchestrated sabotage. "James, you're being manipulated by personal loyalty," Madison replied sharply. Audrey Brown cultivated inappropriately personal relationships with clients that created dangerous dependencies. "We had to restructure her role to protect the firm's long-term interests." "Inappropriately personal?" Richard Hayes leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Madison, I've reviewed the client satisfaction scores and feedback reports. Audrey's relationships with Fortune 500 executives were exemplary by any professional standard. What exactly made them inappropriate?" The question exposed the fundamental weakness in Madison's narrative. Throughout the crisis, she had made accusations about Audrey's conduct without providing concrete evidence of actual misconduct. The client departures weren't supporting her claims of unethical behavior. They were contradicting them. Robert's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his assistant. He read it with growing dismay before addressing the room. "Stevens International has just formally terminated their contract. That makes 6 clients lost in less than 72 hours. The announcement hit the room like a physical blow. Stevens International had been Audrey's 6th Fortune 500 acquisition, the crown jewel of her unprecedented success. Their departure completed the exodus, leaving Whitmore Associates with essentially no major corporate clients and a financial crisis that threatened the firm's survival. "This is what she wanted," Madison said, her voice rising with desperation. "Audrey Brown planned this destruction from the beginning. She cultivated client dependencies, specifically to create leverage for exactly this kind of sabotage." "Madison," Robert's voice cut through his daughter's accusations with the authority of someone who had finally seen enough. "Just stop. I've listened to your explanations, your justifications, your conspiracy theories, and none of them, address the fundamental question: why did we destroy our most successful? The question hung in the air like an indictment, and for the first time since the crisis began, Madison seemed genuinely speechless. Her father was no longer enabling her narrative, no longer accepting her explanations, no longer protecting her from the consequences of her actions. Thomas Anderson, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke from his position at the table's periphery. "I need to be honest about something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was approached about supporting the action against Audrey weeks before her latest client success. Madison told me it was about protecting the firm's collaborative culture, but I think we all know it was really about protecting her position from someone whose competence made her look inadequate." The admission was devastating in its honesty. Thomas, who had been Madison's primary ally in the conspiracy against Audrey, was essentially confessing that the entire scheme had been motivated by jealousy rather than legitimate business concern. Margaret Sullivan consulted her tablet before delivering another blow. "I've been contacted by 3 executive search firms in the past hour. Word is spreading throughout the industry about our client losses, and we're already seeing inquiries about key personnel availability. Our employees are starting to receive external offers." The talent exodus was beginning, and Robert realized that Madison's actions had created a cascading crisis that threatened every aspect of the firm's operation. Losing clients was devastating, but losing the employees who served those clients would make recovery impossible. "We need to consider our options," Richard Hayes said. "Quiet, emergency credit facilities to manage cash flow, potential merger discussions with larger firms, maybe even Chapter 11 restructuring, if the situation doesn't stabilize quickly." The words that no one had wanted to speak were finally on the table. Whitmore Associates, a firm that had weathered economic downturns, industry disruptions and competitive challenges for 3 decades, was facing potential bankruptcy because of a personal vendetta disguised as corporate strategy. Sarah Chen appeared in the conference room doorway, her face flushed with the urgency of someone bearing additional bad news. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Catherine Reed is on line 1. She's calling on behalf of what she's describing as a consortium of former Whitmore clients who want to discuss the firm's future business practices." The implications were clear. The departed clients weren't just leaving quietly, they were organizing, potentially preparing to make public statements about their reasons for terminating relationships with Whitmore and Associates. The reputational damage could extend far beyond the immediate financial crisis. Robert looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the reflection of his own ambition distorted by entitlement and insecurity. Madison had inherited his drive but none of his business acumen, his determination but none of his ethical foundation. She had become everything he had tried to avoid during his own climb to success. "Madison," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of disappointed expectations, "you're suspended from all client-facing responsibilities effective immediately. The board will be conducting a comprehensive review of your role in this crisis." The words hit Madison like a physical blow, and for the first time since the crisis began, her composure cracked completely. "Dad, you can't do this. I was protecting the company. I was protecting our legacy." "You destroyed our legacy," Robert replied, his voice carrying a sadness that seemed to age him before their eyes. "You destroyed it because you were more concerned with protecting your position than building the company's future." As the meeting dissolved into emergency planning sessions and damage control strategies, Robert Whitmore sat alone at the head of the table, staring out at the Chicago skyline that had once represented endless possibilities. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, Audrey Brown was probably building something new and better from the ashes of his daughter's betrayal. The reckoning was complete, and its consequences would reshape everything he had thought he understood about success, family, and the true cost of choosing loyalty over justice. The offices of Brown and Harrison Consulting occupied the 35th floor of a sleek glass tower in Chicago's River North District, with panoramic views that captured both the energy of the business district and the promise of new horizons. 3 weeks after her resignation from Whitmore and Associates, Audrey Brown stood in her new conference room, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and possibility. The space was smaller than what she had left behind, but it pulsed with the authentic energy that comes from building something meaningful rather than navigating institutional politics. The Stevens International contract just came through, David Harrison announced as he entered the conference room, holding a tablet that displayed the digital signature confirmation they had been waiting for. Full strategic transformation project, 3-year timeline, $52 million. That makes it official. We've now secured every Fortune 500 client that left Whitmore Associates. The magnitude of their achievement was still settling. 6 Fortune 500 companies had not only followed Audrey to her new firm but had expanded their consulting engagements, demonstrating a level of confidence in her capabilities that Madison Whitmore had never understood. These weren't just business transactions. They were validations of everything Audrey believed about authentic relationship building and merit-based success. Catherine Reed wants to schedule a celebration dinner, Audrey said, reviewing the messages on her phone. She's invited the other CEOs to what she's calling a founder's toast for the firm. Apparently, word is spreading throughout Fortune 500 circles about our launch. David smiled as he settled into the chair across from her, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had bet on excellence and watched it pay dividends. Catherine told me yesterday that 3 other manufacturing CEOs have asked for introductions. We're not just succeeding, we're becoming the cautionary tale that's making other executives reconsider their own consulting relationships. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Madison's attempt to destroy Audrey's career had inadvertently created a case study in what happened when talent was systematically suppressed by institutional politics. The business community was taking notice, and the lessons extended far beyond consulting services. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and her expression bright with the excitement of someone who had just made a life-changing decision. "I hope that job offer is still open," she said, her voice carrying both determination and nervousness. "I submitted my resignation to Whitmore Associates this morning." Audrey felt a surge of warmth that went beyond professional satisfaction. Sarah's decision to join the firm represented more than just another talented employee. It validated the culture they were building, the principle that competence and integrity would attract other people who shared those values. "Sarah, welcome to Brown & Harrison Consulting," David said, standing to shake her hand. "We've been hoping you'd decide to join us. Your analytical skills and technical expertise will be invaluable as we scale our operations." "What finally convinced you?" Audrey asked, genuinely curious about Sarah's decision-making process. "Yesterday's all-hands meeting," Sarah replied, settling into a chair at the conference table. "Madison tried to rally the remaining staff by blaming our client losses on industrial sabotage and unethical competitor practices. She actually suggested that former employees who joined competing firms were engaging in corporate espionage. The accusation was both predictable and desperate. Madison's inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her actions had led to increasingly paranoid explanations that blamed external forces rather than acknowledging the systematic failures of her leadership approach. "How did people respond?" David asked, though his expression suggested he could guess. "James Mitchell stood up and publicly disagreed," Sarah continued, her eyes bright with remembered satisfaction. "He said that client departures were the predictable result of punitive treatment toward the firm's most successful employee, not the result of any external conspiracy. He essentially called Madison's leadership toxic in front of the entire company." The image of James Mitchell finally finding his moral courage was deeply satisfying to Audrey. The man who had been forced to participate in her destruction had apparently reached his own breaking point with Madison's increasingly erratic behavior. "I have more news about James," Sarah added, consulting her notes. "He's been approached by headhunters from 3 different consulting firms. Word in the industry is that experienced partners are fleeing Whitmore Associates because the toxic culture has become untenable." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "That raises an interesting question. We're going to need senior leadership as we expand, and James Mitchell has 15 years of excellent reputation in the industry. Would you be open to offering him a partnership position?" The proposal sparked a complex mix of emotions in Audrey. James had been her mentor and champion, but he had also enabled her destruction when it became professionally convenient. Could she work with someone whose moral compromises had contributed to her betrayal, even if he was now showing the courage she had needed from him months earlier? I think James deserves a chance to prove that his conscience is stronger than his survival instincts, Audrey said finally. But any partnership would need to be earned through demonstrated commitment to our values, not granted based on past relationships. The conversation was interrupted by Audrey's phone ringing with a call from an unknown number. She answered to find a reporter from Chicago Business Journal, asking for comment on what they were calling the Whitmore exodus and its implications for the consulting industry. Brown, industry sources suggest that your departure from Whitmore Associates triggered the largest client defection in Chicago consulting history, the reporter said. Can you comment on the circumstances that led to this unprecedented situation? Audrey chose her words carefully, aware that anything she said would become part of the public record. Brown and Harrison Consulting is focused on delivering exceptional value to our Fortune 500 clients through competence, integrity, and authentic relationship building. Our success speaks to the market's appetite for consulting services that prioritize client outcomes over internal politics. Sources familiar with the situation suggest that your treatment at Whitmore Associates was retaliatory and potentially discriminatory, the reporter pressed. Are you considering legal action against your former employer? We're focused on building our new firm rather than litigating past grievances, Audrey replied diplomatically. The market will ultimately decide which approach to business creates more value for clients and employees. After ending the call, Audrey realized that their success was becoming a public story that extended beyond their immediate industry. The business press was framing their launch as a David versus Goliath narrative that resonated with anyone who had experienced workplace injustice or institutional betrayal. We need to be prepared for increased attention, David observed. Success at this level makes you a target for people who prefer the status quo. As if summoned by his words, Audrey's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Enjoy your moment in the sun. The market has a way of correcting itself when people forget their place. The message was obviously from Madison Whitmore, and its tone revealed someone who still couldn't accept the reality of her situation. Even facing the potential destruction of her family's company, Madison was focused on threats rather than reflection, politics rather than performance. Some people never learn, Sarah observed, reading the message over Audrey's shoulder. Madison still thinks this is about personalities rather than principles. Audrey deleted the message without responding, recognizing that engagement would only feed Madison's need for conflict. The market was already delivering its verdict on their respective approaches to business, and no amount of threatening messages would change the fundamental dynamics that had led to this outcome. As the afternoon sunlight filled their new conference room, the three partners of Brown and Harrison Consulting began planning their expansion strategy, their conversation animated by the excitement of people building something meaningful from scratch. Outside their windows, Chicago's business district hummed with the energy of commerce and competition, but inside their offices, something different was taking shape. A firm built on the radical idea that competence and integrity could triumph over politics and privilege. The new beginning was more than just a business venture. It was proof that authentic leadership could emerge from the ashes of institutional failure, that talent and determination could create opportunities that transcended the limitations of corrupt systems. Madison Whitmore had unknowingly given them the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to prove that excellence, when freed from the constraints of toxic culture, could reshape entire industry. 1 year later, Audrey Brown stood at the podium of the Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony, holding a crystal trophy that represented more than professional recognition. It symbolized the vindication of every principle she had fought to preserve. The award for Consulting Firm of the Year was accompanied by a client satisfaction rating that had never been achieved in the industry's recorded history. But the real victory was more profound than any metric could capture. Brown and Harrison Consulting now occupied 3 floors of their River North Tower, employing 47 professionals who had been carefully selected for both competence and character. The firm's success had attracted talent from across the industry, including James Mitchell, who had joined 6 months earlier, as senior partner after proving his commitment to ethical leadership through a painful but necessary period of self-reflection. Excellence isn't just about individual achievement, Audrey said to the audience of business leaders gathered in the ballroom. It's about creating environments where talent can flourish, where integrity is rewarded, and where success is measured by the value we create for others rather than the power we accumulate for ourselves. The words were aimed at the broader business community, but she knew that somewhere in the audience sat representatives from companies that had learned difficult lessons about the true cost of toxic leadership. The story of Whitmore and Associates had become a cautionary tale that was studied in business schools and discussed in boardrooms across the country. Catherine Reed, seated at the head table as the evening's keynote speaker, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had bet on principle and watched it pay extraordinary dividends. Her decision to follow Audrey to the new firm had influenced dozens of other Fortune 500 executives to reconsider their own consulting relationships, creating a ripple effect that had reshaped industry standards. Audrey Brown represents something that's often missing in today's business environment. Catherine had said during her introduction, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the personal cost is enormous. Her success isn't just a business story, it's a reminder that authentic leadership ultimately prevails over institutional politics. From her position at the podium, Audrey could see David Harrison in the audience, his expression carrying the pride of someone who had taken a calculated risk on excellence and watched it transform an entire industry. Their partnership had evolved beyond business success into a shared mission of proving that companies built on merit and integrity could compete with and ultimately surpass organizations that relied on politics and privilege. Sarah Chen, now a junior partner responsible for the firm's expanding analytics division, sat nearby with a team of brilliant young professionals who represented the future of ethical business leadership. Her journey from idealistic analyst to accomplished executive served as proof that talent, when properly nurtured, could flourish in ways that benefited everyone. The evening's program included a brief video presentation about the consulting industry's evolution over the past year. The segment featured interviews with business leaders who had made significant changes to their organizational cultures, many citing the Whitmore crisis as a wake-up call about the dangers of nepotism and toxic leadership. Robert Whitmore himself had participated in the documentary, his appearance marking a remarkable transformation from enabler to advocate for systemic change. His company had survived the crisis through radical restructuring that prioritized competence over connections, merit over manipulation. The process had been painful but necessary, and his candid acknowledgement of past mistakes had begun to restore some measure of respect for the Whitmore name. I allowed family loyalty to override business judgment, he had said in the interview. The result was nearly losing everything I had spent 30 years building. Sometimes the greatest act of love is holding people accountable for their actions, especially when they're family. Madison Whitmore had left the consulting industry entirely, her reputation too damaged by the crisis to allow for professional rehabilitation. Reports suggested she was pursuing opportunities in her family's charitable foundation, though even there her involvement was limited by board concerns about leadership and judgment. The market had delivered its verdict with brutal efficiency. Thomas Anderson's career had stalled completely, his opportunistic choices during the crisis marking him as someone who couldn't be trusted when principles conflicted with personal advancement. He remained at a restructured Whitmore Associates in a junior role, a daily reminder of the cost of choosing politics over performance. As Audrey concluded her acceptance speech, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The salary cut that had seemed devastating had actually freed her from a system that could never have rewarded her true potential. The character assassination that had threatened to destroy her reputation had instead created opportunities to demonstrate her integrity under pressure. The events of the past year have taught us that authentic success isn't about climbing corporate ladders or accumulating institutional power, she continued. It's about building relationships based on trust, creating value through competence, and having the courage to stand up for principles even when the personal cost seems overwhelming. The audience erupted in sustained applause, but Audrey's thoughts had already moved beyond this moment of recognition to the future they were building together. Brown and Harrison Consulting was expanding internationally, with offices planned in London and Singapore. More importantly, Their approach to business was influencing competitors and clients alike to prioritize substance over politics. The consulting industry would never be the same, but the changes extended far beyond their sector. Companies across every industry were re-examining their leadership development programs, their promotion criteria, and their organizational cultures. The question was no longer whether merit-based systems were practical, but how quickly they could be implemented. As Audrey returned to her table, she found a handwritten note that had been placed beside her seat during the presentation. The message was simple but powerful. "Thank you for showing us that integrity isn't just an ideal, it's a competitive advantage. Your courage changed everything." A grateful industry. The note was unsigned, but it captured something essential about what they had accomplished together. The Fortune Rebellion had begun as one person's refusal to accept injustice, but it had evolved into a movement that was transforming how business was conducted at the highest level. Looking around the ballroom at the faces of executives who had been inspired to examine their own practices, Audrey understood that the real victory wasn't personal vindication, it was systemic change. Madison Whitmore's attempt to destroy her had inadvertently triggered a renaissance of ethical leadership that would benefit countless professionals for years to come. The rebellion was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. In boardrooms and conference centers across the world, a new generation of leaders was proving that excellence, integrity, and authentic relationship building weren't just moral imperatives, they were the foundation of sustainable competitive advantage. The future belonged to those brave enough to earn it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.